Hi, my name is Sarah. Today we're looking at portraiture, that is, an overview from the 19th century to contemporary art. We're focusing on the painted portrait using largely French and British examples. Portrait art expanded during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution meant wealth creation, which generated a new middle class who looked to commission portraits as a way of making a permanent visual record of individuals and families. It was the ultimate status symbol. A portrait commission was often a vital source of income for artists. In the first half of the 19th century, Romantic art dominated. The primary focus was on self-expression with a dramatic, emotional, and sometimes heroic style. The first example that we're going to look at is by the French artist Théodore Géricault. This is called Portrait of a Kleptomaniac. In France, Géricault was also one of the best portrait artists of his time. He was a history painter as well, noted in particular for his series of haunting realist studies of asylum inmates painted in the 1820s, of which this is one of the series. The series reflected the notion at the time that there was a link between mental illness and facial expression. We see Géricault's interest in facial expression in this painting and how it is balanced by his romantic empathy. This is a depiction of a sad man, it seems to me. Notice the intense gaze of this man. We see that he has a neglected beard and a somewhat dirty neck against his collar. This painting typifies the thinking of the romantic painters and writers of the time. They looked to pursue the truth, or what they perceived to be the truth, through the observation of reality. The next example is a painting by Eugène Delacroix. He was the leader of the French Romantic school. His use of expressive brushstrokes and his study of the optical effects of colour profoundly shaped the work of the Impressionist artists later in the century. He's probably most famous for his large history painting, Liberty Leading the People, from 1830. This, however, is a portrait by Delacroix, and it's called Orphan Girl in Cemetery from 1824. Again, we see the hallmarks of romantic portraiture: drama, emotion, atmospheric lighting, and inspirational content. There's an air of sorrow, the girl's eyes well with tears. The dimness of the sky and the empty cemetery are in line with her melancholic expression. Her body language and clothing suggest tragedy and vulnerability. The dress drooping down from her shoulder, attractively, it has to be said, her hand laid weakly on her thigh, and the shadows around the nape of her neck. All of these things combine to emphasize a sense of loss and isolation. For Delacroix, colours were the most important consideration in his paintings. For inspiration, he looked to the great Venetian colourist Titian and the Baroque portraitist Rubens. Moving on to the middle of the 19th century and the school of realism. French artist Jean-François Millet was a farmer's son and founder of the Barbizon school. Now, these were a group of artists who gathered in rural France in Barbizon to paint directly from nature. In Barbizon, he focused on rural life and produced many genre paintings. These are paintings of scenes of everyday life. In these paintings, he would exalt the work of peasants and labourers. He really put ordinary people and their lives centre stage, like his contemporary Gustave Courbet. Here we have Man with a Hoe by Millet. Many of you may be familiar with his painting, The Gleaners. This man here, the farmer, is every man. He is big and dirty and utterly exhausted by the back-breaking work of turning this rocky, thistle-ridden earth into a productive field. Perhaps like the one being worked in the distance. You can just see on the left-hand side in the background, very painted really in a very tiny way. There's a man ploughing on the left-hand side and a woman tending some bonfires on the right. This painting is a tribute to dignity and courage in the face of a life of adversity. Man with a hoe was long considered a symbol of the labouring class. Millet himself wrote, "As I have never seen anything but fields since I was born, I try to say as best I can what I saw and felt when I was at work." At the annual Salon exhibition in Paris in 1863, Man with a Hoe, this painting, caused a storm of controversy. The man depicted was considered brutish and frightening by the Parisian bourgeoisie. Moving on to academic painting. Academic painting ran concurrently with the romantic and realist styles that we've just seen. Academic painting was influenced by the standards of the French Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. That was the official or approved style of art. It was a fixed set of aesthetic standards, formal, classical compositions. Largely, it was a standard and style of art as developed during the Renaissance. And really, it was anything other than romantic style. Among its top exponents in the 19th century was French neoclassical artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And here's an example of one of his portraits. Now Ingres saw himself as a history painting on a grand scale, and he achieved some success with that. But his real legacy is in portraiture. Here's the portrait of the Comtesse de Zonville. The sitter was Louise de Broglie. She was a countess from a wealthy French noble family. By 1845, when this was painted, Ingres' fame was at its height, and he was much in demand as a portraitist. Louise herself was a highly educated essayist and biographer, including writing a biography of Robert Emmet, highly unusually for the time. She's 27 here and the mother of 3 children. Ingres worked on this over 3 years with many false starts and preparatory drawings. In the end, the artist noted the finished work had received, in his own words, a storm of approval. A close friend of the family told him he must have been in love to depict her this way. And yes, there is something provocatively intimate in this scene, as though he has caught her in a corner of her boudoir, nonchalantly leaning against the upholstered cover on the mantelpiece. His portraits have an almost photographic realness. He paid huge attention to detail, especially concerning fabrics, and we can certainly see it in this painting. Her dress is magnificently painted. Notice also the details on the mantelpiece. I think there's flowers, a clock just behind her, a vase to her left, as we see at her right. Notice also the reflection of the back of her neck, the detail at the back of the line of her dress, her hair arrangement and hairpiece, and almost a little bit of her profile reflected in the mirror. Although Ingres was profoundly influenced by past artistic traditions, he was an important precursor of modern art. Artists continued their ongoing scholarly fascination with Ingres throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. As a fastidious draftsman, he appealed to modern artists such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse in the early 20th century. Like Ingres, Picasso would create a world with a few lines of the pen, adding colour after his design. Edgar Degas, another French artist in the late 19th century, also derived inspiration directly from Ingres' work. Like him, Degas studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris before leaving for Italy, for 5 years to focus on the Renaissance work of Italian masters. Here we have a painting by Degas called The Bellelli Family. Now, you may well know of Degas, of course, for his pastel drawings and paintings of women bathing and ballerinas. But here, a young Degas painted his aunt, her husband, and 2 daughters. This large painting was based on studies drawn up in Italy when he went to visit them. It would have been hard to set up such a large canvas in an interior space, particularly in an apartment. It's 2 meters by 2.5 meters, so it's a really huge painting. The family doesn't appear to be unified, and we know from his aunt's letters to him that she was in fact miserable. The work of many artists provided the young Degas with inspiration for this magnificent painting. From the Italian Renaissance masters to 17th century Dutch genre painting, to portrait studies by Ingres that we looked at, but probably most of all by Spanish artist Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, painted in 1656 and in the Prado in Madrid. We're going to look at this briefly because I'm going to talk about it for this painting and another. So this is Las Meninas, and it's one of the most important paintings in Western art history. It is a snapshot of the members of the court of Philip IV in Madrid, and largely the figures represented are the monarch's family. It's a complex composition which is all about what the viewer perceives, what us, the viewer, perceives, whether it is reality or illusion. And within the image, there's a picture, a mirror, and a doorway, and all of these devices are used to expand the space of the interior. Las Meninas may have inspired Degas to extend the space of the apartment by employing some of the same elements. Here too, a picture, a doorway, and a reflected image in a mirror, all prominent and all very well considered. This painting, when viewed alongside the work of Degas' contemporaries, is unique. The uniqueness is largely due to the composition and its vastness. So here we have a family portrait painted on the grand scale of a historical drama. The content has been interpreted as psychologically penetrating. The placement of the figures suggests the parents' alienation from one another, and their children appear to have divided loyalties. Laura, the mother, stands as if for an official portrait. Her expression indicates her unhappiness. One hand rests protectively on Giovanna's shoulder, the other balances her pregnant body. Julia, the younger daughter, is seated in the center of the painting and is a compositional link between her estranged parents. Gennaro, their father, appears indifferent, turned toward but seated apart from his family. His back is to us and his face is mostly in shadow. The drawing on the wall behind them is a portrait of the recently deceased Hilaire Degas, who is her brother and Degas' father. By placing it directly behind his aunt's head, Degas was connecting the generations of his family and following a convention of portraiture used since the Renaissance, that of including ancestral effigies. This is a painting by James McNeill Whistler called Arrangement in Grey and Black No. 1. Whistler was an American artist based primarily in the United Kingdom, in London. Anna, depicted here, his mother, posed for her son in his house in London. It's one of the most famous works by an American artist outside the United States. We see an elderly figure seated, staring enigmatically into the distance. The portrait was intended to demonstrate Whistler's recent focus on tonal harmonies over subject matter. So the balancing of colours was his primary interest. It manages to be both a detailed and abstract painting. We see the detail in the flowers at the bottom half of the curtain on the left-hand side, beautiful detailing in the lace ribbons hanging from his mother's bonnet on the shoulders, the shoulders of her black dress, the napkin in her lap, the cuffs of her sleeve, but otherwise broad bands of colour in vertical and horizontal lines. The composition, better known today as Whistler's Mother, was initially met with puzzlement, but it was soon lauded, and it spurred reproductions in various media and endless references within popular culture, and it's become something really of an icon of motherhood, particularly in North America. It was used as an image on a stamp at one point. Whistler was a leading proponent of the credo, art for art's sake. Really, that means aesthetic, compositional, and colour arrangement over subject. He found a parallel between painting and music and titled many of his paintings arrangements, harmonies, nocturnes. So really, again, emphasizing the importance or the primacy of tonal harmony. This obsession with colour and composition greatly influenced modern art. John Singer Sargent was another American expat artist living in London. He was the most successful portrait painter of his era, using a mostly realistic technique, often infused with brilliant use of colour. His commission portraits are consistent with the grand banner of portrait painting, while his informal studies in landscape indicate he was very aware of contemporary trends, and these are more impressionistic in style. His masterpieces include this painting, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boit from 1882. We see 4 young girls, sisters, in the foyer of the family's Paris apartment. It's a very large painting, square in shape. It hangs in the Boston Museum of Fine Art, and the Japanese vases that you see were bequeathed to the Boston Museum after the daughter's death. And the painting now hangs between the 2 vases, which is really effective, as you can imagine. It's an unusual composition. The members of the family aren't painted with or given equal status in the family. It's almost hierarchical. And again, it copies much from Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, like Degas' Bellelli family. We see these broad, deep spaces. It's square in shape. Las Meninas, of course, in English means ladies in waiting. And it's psychologically complex, like Degas' Bellelli family. The girls are 4, 12, 8, and 14. The face of the 14-year-old adolescent daughter is hidden. Is she self-conscious? Is it a representation of her move from childhood to womanhood? The painting appears to be as much about the subject of childhood as it is an example of portraiture. The girls are seen at successive phases of childhood. It's probably also worth mentioning when talking about Velázquez's Las Meninas, any of you who are familiar with the collection in the National Gallery in Dublin will know of John Lavery's portrait of his family called The Artist's Studio, which takes much from Las Meninas as well. And if anybody's familiar with it, they'll know about again, that depth of space, the scale of painting, this interior with reflective surfaces and doorways, and his family, his wife Hazel Lavery, his daughter Eileen, and stepdaughter Alice depicted in the foreground. Another painting of Sargent's that we're going to look at today is the portrait of Hugh Lane in the Dublin City Gallery collection, painted in 1906. Now, Hugh Lane was an admirer of Sargent, and this work was commissioned by Lane supporters and presented to him in 1907 in recognition, and I quote, of his strenuous labour for the public good, tireless energy and splendid generosity, combined with brilliant organising capabilities and fine judgment. Sargent depicts Lane, the art dealer, the collector, and founder of one of the first galleries of modern art, as a languid and elegant figure. He is elegantly dressed with a romantic and almost melancholic expression. The portrait had pride of place in Lane's own home. Now, moving on to Impressionism, the French painter Edouard Manet was an important transitional artist between the realist style and the Impressionist style. He liked to paint unconventional subject matter drawn from modern life, and his novel approach to the handling of paint made him a huge influence on the younger Impressionist artist, but also an important precursor of the Impressionist style. This is an example of Manet's work. He was a portraitist of outstanding insight and technique, and this painting, Eva Gonzalez, which is in the Dublin City Gallery Hugh Lane collection and shared with the National Gallery in London, is an excellent example of his transitional style. Now, Eva Gonzalez, the subject of the painting, she was an accomplished painter, a pupil of Manet's, and a good friend of the artist. She was a frequent model of his and many of the Impressionist artists. In this large portrait painted for the 1870s salon, she's seated on a finely drawn chair, resplendent in her white dress, painting at her easel. Now you can see the dress, the extent to which Manet reveled in the fabrics and forms of women's fashions. He does acknowledge her skill as an artist, but he doesn't necessarily represent her as a professional. I mean, she has no artist's smock, for example. She's painting at an unlikely angle from a distance, it would be very awkward. We do, however, see on the right-hand side a portfolio resting against the back of her seat and a rolled canvas on the floor. Notice, for all the finely drawn face and hair and detail and the bodice part of her dress, you notice the loose brush stroke in the detail, the flowers on the carpet. There's a white camellia on the carpet and the tones echo the white dress. Again, the slightly looser brush stroke in the skirt of her dress. It manages to be a painting that's both formal and informal. By the 1870s, Impressionism as a style had really come to the fore. Now, partly due to their meagre incomes, many of the Impressionist artists relied on family and friends to model for them. They painted intimate groups and single figures, either outdoors or in light-filled interiors. The group of artists were noted for their shimmering surfaces and rich dabs of paint, loose brushstrokes. Impressionist portraits are often disarmingly intimate and appealing. One example of many is this by Pierre-Auguste Renoir, La Loge, and this is a theatre box. It depicts a young couple in a box at a Paris theatre. The woman was modelled by Nini Lopez, who was a regular model for Renoir, and the other is Renoir's brother, Edmond, who is a journalist and an art critic. Now, going to the theatre was as much about being seen as watching their performance. And while Nini is making her presence obvious, her companion is scanning the audience through his opera glasses. She's fashionably dressed with a flower in her hair. Again, women's fashions played a huge part in the images in Impressionist portraits. The unusual angle that it's painted at, framed, if you like, by the line of the theatre box and from a height. This was influenced by the aesthetics of Japanese woodcut prints or ukiyo-e prints, which were hugely popular at the time. Here we see Parisians at leisure, scenes of the bourgeois enjoying themselves, again, a very typical Impressionist motif. Often they were outdoor boating scenes, often indoors, cafe scenes, theatre scenes, as we see here, all typically Impressionist. Notice the loose application of bright paints, the loose brushstrokes, particularly evident in the clothes, Now, new pigments had come on the market, and with them, a new understanding of how colour mixed in the viewer's eye. It's important to talk about photography within the context of Impressionist art. The influence of photography and its widespread use in the form of portable cameras greatly influenced artists from the mid to late 19th century on. It provided a cheap alternative and therefore supplanted much of the lowest level of portrait painting. So from the time of the Impressionists onwards, portrait painters found a myriad number of ways to reinterpret the portrait to compete effectively with photography. Rather than attempting to replicate reality, artists began to understand that the value of their profession was not in imitation, but in conveying feelings and ideas and atmosphere to express through colour, composition, and brushstroke either an impression of a scene or to convey a deeper understanding and of people, a person or persons. Post-Impressionism is an umbrella term for a number of different styles that followed Impressionism during the 1880s and until the about 1900. This painting by Paul Cézanne, Woman with a Coffee Pot, is typical of post-impressionistic work. Now, form and colour were central to French artist Cézanne's portraits. The main elements in the composition, the woman's body, the cup, the coffee pot, are painted in a highly simplified way in a strict arrangement of horizontal and vertical lines. This geometric approach to volumes and the slant of the table shown at a higher angle than the object standing on it mark the beginnings of Cubism as an art form. The painting records the shift in Cézanne's art, 20 years after he had begun to move away from Impressionism. He wished, and I quote, to treat nature through cylinders, spheres, and cones, and he's approached this portrait a little like a still life. Nevertheless, the model's work-roughened hands and plain but dignified face show the painter's sympathy for his subject. Vincent Van Gogh was a hugely prolific artist. He painted portraits throughout his career. From mid-career onwards, Van Gogh used colour and brushstroke to express the sitter's inner qualities and his own relationship with them. This is a self-portrait from 1889 in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and it's likely to have been his last self-portrait. Like Rembrandt and Goya, Van Gogh often used himself as a model. He produced over 43 self-portraits in a 10-year period. Like the old masters, he observed himself critically in a mirror. He wrote to his sister, "I'm looking for a deeper likeness than that obtained by a photograph." In this head and shoulder view, the artist is wearing a suit and not the pea jacket he usually worked in. Attention is focused on the face. His features are hard in a thin face. His green-rimmed eyes seem anxious. The dominant colour, a mix of a sort of pale absinthe green and turquoise, find a counterpoint in their complementary colour, the fiery orange of the beard and hair. The model's stillness contrasts with the undulating hair and beard, echoed and amplified in the swirling, almost hypnotic background, no doubt reflecting his own precarious mental health. Moving on to the 20th century. Early 20th century artists also expanded the repertoire of portraiture in new directions. French artist Henri Matisse produced powerful portraits using non-naturalistic, even garish colours for skin tones. Woman with a Hat, painted in 1905, La Femme au Chapeau, depicts Matisse's wife, Amélie. When it was exhibited, it was at the centre of the controversy that led to the term fauvisme, The critics referred to these works by Matisse and his contemporaries painting with these bright, bright colours as fauvists, wild beasts. It was also a painting that marked a stylistic shift in the work of Matisse, from the more graphic and dense colour blocking of his earlier work to a more expressive style. Its loose brushwork and unfinished quality shocked viewers as much as its vivid, non-naturalistic colours. Prolific Spanish artist Pablo Picasso painted many portraits, including several cubist renderings of his mistresses, in which the likeness of the subject is grossly distorted to achieve an emotional statement. This is a portrait of Dora Maar from 1937. She was a young Yugoslavian photographer, and here is Dora represented seated in an armchair, smiling and resting her head on her long-fingered hand. Her face is shown in a combined frontal and profile view, with different coloured eyes looking in different directions. These angles or distortions are the hallmark of Picasso's work. The idea is that they've expressed the full possibility of the subject. They capture all aspects of the sitter. Where Ingres used the traditional convention of the mirror to represent his model frontally and in profile, as we saw on the Comtesse d'Ozonville, the lovely lady in the blue dress, the back of whom we saw reflected in the mirror. Picasso used this technique, pictorial fusion, that is, multiple viewpoints represented, developed over time through his cubist experiments. He is determined to pin down Dora Maar, to express her physical characteristics, her temperament, and also the painter's vision of her. The physical details, fingernails painted red, the long, graceful hands, the pose, the black hair, the large, dark, staring eyes. The face is given volume by a play of colours and lighting. Her expression is pleasant but distant. The cross structures of the chair and of the embroidery, the squared pattern of her skirt, and the vertical and horizontal stripes of the background give the impression of a cell or a confined space, perhaps a suggestion of her mental state. Now, portrait production in Europe declined in the 1940s and 50s. Art really was focused on abstract art. Non-figurative art became the dominant theme, the dominant subject, really. By the 1960s and 70s, there was a revival of portraiture. British artists such as Lucian Freud, the grandson of Sigmund Freud, and Irish-born Francis Bacon both produced powerful portrait paintings throughout their careers. This is a painting by Francis Bacon called George Dyer Talking. It sold, interestingly, in Christie's in 2004 at auction for £42.2 million. Now, George Dyer was Bacon's lover at the time, and he was the subject of many of his works during the 1960s, arguably his most creative period. It was Dyer's vulnerability and physicality that captivated Bacon. So Bacon sets Dyer's nude or almost nude figure against a palette of deep pinks and purples. Those strong colour backdrops are typical of Bacon's work. Dyer is seated on a revolving office stool. His body and face are contorted, his legs tightly crossed, hands clasped. The legs are barely distinct, the documents scattered, the legs almost melting into the documents. The sweeping curves of the room are echoed in Dyer's body. Above him hangs a naked light bulb. This was also typically Bacon. He liked to establish the setting with lights, switches, and 3D frames, all to give a nondescript space, context, and depth. Dyer was an alcoholic and deeply depressed. He took his own life 4 years later on the eve of the opening of Bacon's retrospective in Paris in 1971. This is a photographic portrait of George Dyer taken the year before by John Deacon in Rees Mews in South Kensington. This is Bacon's studio. And it's very much, as you can see, the work on which the painting was based. Bacon's sources and references were many, but he most often worked from photographs of friends, as he preferred this to live sitters in his studio. The last painting we're going to look at is by Lucian Freud, and suitably impactful. This is called Benefits Supervisor Resting from 1994. Freud was a British painter specializing in figurative art like Francis Bacon and is known as one of the foremost 20th century portraitists. He presents the naked form with majesty. It's remarkably candid. This is the second of 4 paintings of Sue Tilley, who was a job center supervisor who modeled for Freud. Freud has taken one of the greatest themes of art history, the nude. This modern interpretation illustrates his tremendous skill. This is widely acclaimed as one of Freud's greatest works. Here she is, Sue, settled on a sofa in the painter's modest London studio. He bought the sofa specifically for this. He apparently liked the delicate worn pattern on the fabric and the gentle colours. It was painted over a 9-month period in 1994. Each brushstroke a subtly different tone. It's almost as if he has sculpted her flesh. Every fold, curve, blemish, and contour is evident. Freud always worked from life and was known for asking for extended and punishing sittings from his models. This painting has been exhibited alongside a selection of grand master nudes and very much holds its own. It sold at auction in 2011 for $56.2 million, just to give an indication. To conclude, portraiture was flourishing during the 19th century. Commissions were an important source of income for artists. There was, however, a hierarchy of genre, and portraiture was considered second-rate. The belief at the time that the true value of art lay in history painting, historical, religious, or mythological themes. This subject matter, it was considered, was what had true cultural value. The development of modern art towards the end of the 19th and into the 20th century saw a real shift in this perception. The Impressionists and Post-Impressionists took the portrait as a central theme. They raised the status of the art form with their innovative and avant-garde experimentation, to the point that the figurative artists Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud are considered among the greatest of the modern era. Thank you very much for listening. The final slide, if you'd like any further details about the Hugh Lane Gallery's education programme, please go to this website. Thanks again.